everyone, Professor Davis here, and we are going to dive into the diversity of plants. Now, this chapter is going to be broken into multiple parts. So we're going to be looking at kind of the primitive plants first in this part 1, and the more advanced plants in part 2. And then we're going to look at more of their adaptations and all in some later videos. But let's dive into this diversity. Now, before we really get started, we're going to have to know some terms. Okay, and so these terms are going to be important when we're talking about plants. So for one, we need to know diploid and haploid. Now, if you've already taken like a biology 1 or you've done some stuff with genetics, you should know these terms already. Diploid denotes that you have a full set of chromosomes, and we represent this in a kind of math equation as 2n. Meaning you have one set from mom and one set from dad, and that's why you have 2n. So for us as humans, 2n equals 46. You got 23 from mom, 23 from dad, and that's what gives us our full set. Haploid, on the other hand, denotes that you have half the set of chromosomes, so only n. So again, in humans, this would be 23. Now, diploid and haploid is going to be different depending on what organism we're looking at. Like for corn, the diploid is 20 and the haploid is then 10. Okay, so it just depends on the organism, but these two terms are going to be important because they're going to play a role in how plants are going to reproduce. The next thing we need to look at are what we call the gametes. Gametes are the sex cells. Now, these guys are haploid, meaning that they have half the number of chromosomes. These examples are going to be sperm and ova. Ova is another word for egg. We then have the zygote. The zygote is the first structure formed after fertilization, and this one is 2n, which is diploid. So when an egg and sperm fuse together, n plus n, we then have our 2n again, and that's what we get for our diploid. Now, this brings us to some terms that have to explain how we go from gametes to a zygote. So meiosis is the process that produces spores and reduces the number of chromosomes by half. So this is going to be taking where we go from 2n down to n. And so this is going to be a type of cellular division that goes through dividing twice, creating potentially 4 of these spores or gametes that each have n chromosomes. Okay, so they only have half a set. We then see fertilization. Fertilization is a process that restores the number of chromosomes. So we go from n to 2n. This is a result of the fusion of the egg and the sperm together. All right, so the fusion of the egg and the sperm restores us to our diploid, and we call this fertilization. Now, ultimately, fertilization produces the zygote, which is the term we had before. Then we have mitosis. Mitosis is the process that gameophytes, and we'll talk about what gameophytes are in just a minute, use to produce the gametes. Okay, egg and sperm. We also see that it's the same process the zygote matures into in a plant sporophyte generation. In other words, guys, mitosis is just when we go from 1 cell to 2 cells, 2 cells to 4 cells, 4 cells to 8 cells. And all those cells are identical, and this is what allows us to have a multicellular organism. So what is this gameophyte and sporophyte talking about? So guys, in plants, sporophytes are the generation that produces spores, thus their name. On the other hand, the gameophyte, again breaking down the word, is the generation that produces the gametes. Okay, so gameophyte, and these are going to have N or haploid chromosomes. All right, and so this is going to play a role in just a minute when we talk about how plants reproduce, and they reproduce through a process called alternation of generations. Now, before we get to that, let's talk about plants in general. Okay, so what are the plant's general characteristics? So plants are in the domain eukarya because they contain eukaryotic cells. So remember, these are cells that have a nucleus. They also have lots of different organelles. They're the more complex organisms. We do see that they are also in the kingdom Plantae, meaning plants. So what are some basic characteristics? Well, for one, they have eukaryotic cells, which I just talked about. Plants are always going to be multicellular, okay, meaning they're composed of more than one cell. Okay, that's their level of organization. We also see that plants are non-motile. They don't move on their own. Okay, now we can move them from maybe point A to point B ourselves, but the plant can't move itself. We also see that plants are photosynthetic. They do this through using the sun in order to make their food. So this is what makes them autotrophs. A lot of times this is why we call plants producers, because they produce their own food. And that's their mode of nutrition. We also see that they do have a cell wall around their cells. This cell wall is made out of cellulose. Now, specifically, cellulose is a type of sugar. It ends in ose, and it's a structural sugar. We also see that they have a sexual life cycle. Yes, we do see that plants have male and female parts. They do have a sexual life cycle, but theirs is called the alternation of generation. And we're going to see that it's going to alternate between sporophyte and gamiophyte, and that's why it gets that name. Now, when we're also talking about plants, we do see that they are primarily terrestrial, meaning they mostly are on land. We have a few exceptions that do have the ability to grow in water, but most plants are on land. We do see they have well-developed tissues, so this is not just cellular level. They do have tissues that are present that compose their organisms. We see that they do protect their developing embryo from drying out, and they do this by placing it inside of the female structure of the plant. And we'll get into more detail about that later, but that's going to be where they protect their offspring. We also see that they contain chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a chemical, and it has chlorophylls A and B. Those are going to be the chemicals that make a plant appear green. They also are going to help with photosynthesis. We see that they do contain also another pigment called carotenoids. These are going to be more of an orange or red pigment, but these guys are going to be found inside of that special organelle called the chloroplast. So chloroplasts are going to contain these pigments, and they are going to be responsible in absorbing sunlight for photosynthesis. We also see that they store their food after they make it, because remember, they're making it, they're producing their own food. They're going to store it as a form of sugar called starch. Okay, so they're going to store it as starch. Now, if you'll notice, there were a couple of things that had the two little stars or asterisks around it. We do see that the chlorophyll, the starch, and even having the cell wall of cellulose, we think that that comes from the green algae. Now remember, green algae is not a plant. It is part of the protist group, but it is the protist group that is plant-like. So they do have a few structures that are similar to plants. All right, so these are the basic characteristics of a plant. Now, let's talk about some advantages and some disadvantages of plants being terrestrial or land-dwelling, the fact that they live on land. We do see that when plants that have moved onto land versus what we see with algae, they get increased light availability. Well, now this is really good since they do photosynthesis. The more light that they can collect, the more that they can produce their own food. We also see that part of that process of photosynthesis is not just sunlight. They also need to have access to carbon dioxide, CO2. We have increased amounts of that in the atmosphere versus the water. And so again, both of these are requirements for photosynthesis. And so that would be an advantage with moving on to land. And initially, they did not have any predators when they moved onto land. And so when we look at this, we do see that that's how they flourished and grew. But again, things have developed to become herbivores, which means herbivores eat some of these plants. So now let's talk about some disadvantages. Disadvantages for plants being land dwelling are going to be things like the fact that they would lose water more. Gametes then also need to be protected because they're not going to have that water source like they would if they were growing in water. We also see that there's going to be an increased gravitational pull that they have to overcome. When we are not in water, we see that gravity plays a bigger role. Now, this will pull water down. Okay, they have to have a way to get it up to the top of the plants, because if you'll remember, a lot of these guys, when they're doing photosynthesis, that's in the leaves. The leaves are the green part. We got to get it up there, but the water is being absorbed in the roots. And so this creates a potential issue for plants, but they do have some accommodations. okay? But it isn't disadvantage. We also see that swimming for reproduction is not always possible. A lot of times when we were talking about other organisms, there is going to be where the gamete swims, especially the sperm. It swims from point A to point B in order for fertilization to take place, in order to form that zygote, that new organism. Plants are not going to have that available, especially as they're on land. All right, so that would be considered a disadvantage. So taking these disadvantages into account, how do the plants adapt in order to live on land? How did they develop these certain things that help protect them in order to overcome those disadvantages? Well, for one, there's development of what we call vascular tissue. Vascular tissue is a tissue that provides support to the plant, and it helps them overcome the gravitational pull. Vascular tissue is going to resemble kind of like our arteries and veins. And we see that it's going to be how water and food like sugar are transported throughout the plant. We'll take a closer look at those a little later. We also see that a lot of the plants have developed something called a waxy cuticle. This is going to decrease water loss. Now, we don't want this waxy cuticle on the roots because the roots need to absorb the water. And wax, if you'll recall, is a fat or a lipid. Fats don't like water, so it acts as a protective barrier, so water cannot get through. So we don't want this on the roots because the water has to be absorbed in the root side, but the stems and the leaves will have this waxy cuticle that will help protect it. And you can see it here in the picture of this cross section of a leaf. We also see that in the structure of the leaf, there is going to be these little holes called stomata. Stomata are found on the underside of the leaves, and they can open and close in order to decrease water loss. So if it's really a hot day, the plants can close these off and they won't lose water through their leaves. On the other hand, though, when they do close these, they cannot get access to carbon dioxide as easily. So it's kind of like a catch-22. We don't want to lose water because water is required for photosynthesis, but we also need CO2, which is also required. So they've got to play this balancing game in order to make sure that they gain access. And some plants have some special accommodations for that. And like I said, we will discuss those further later. So plants initially grew low to the ground. That was the point. They didn't have that vascular tissue in order to grow up. And so they had to then develop that waxy cuticle, their vascular system, and defenses in order to prevent from being eaten. All right, so plants have to adapt and be able to change as well, depending on their environment that they are found in. All right, so now let's talk about how plants reproduce. Now, this is known as alternation of generations. So with alternation of generations, you're going to see that we have a line that comes across there that's going to separate our diploid from our haploid. Okay. We also see that above the line is the sporophyte generation, which is the diploid, the 2N, and below the line is the gameophyte generation, which is the N. And we're going to see that this is a cycle, this alternating thing that's going to occur. So we're going to start first over here with fertilization. So fertilization, if you'll recall from our terms, is when an egg and sperm fuse together. Okay, and when they fuse together, they create a zygote. And remember, because we're adding an egg and a sperm, that's N plus N. That's why we have 2N here. Okay, so there's zygote. The zygote is then going to go through mitosis, making more cells, going from 1 cell to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8. Because remember, plants are multicellular. This is going to cause it to develop that sporophyte generation. Okay, it's going to be that part of the plant. This sporophyte generation is going to also create what we call sporangium. Sporangium also contain 2N. Their structure, a special structure on the sporophyte generation, and they are going to be responsible for this area to do the process of meiosis. So you'll notice it's pointing towards meiosis. Now meiosis, guys, is when we are separating into egg and sperm. We're going to create, in this case, spores. Okay, and it's going to be that egg and sperm eventually. So when we look here, meiosis is what's going to take place where we are going to half the number of chromosomes and spores are created. These spores only have N, haploid structure. They only have half the chromosomes. These spores, though, are going to go through mitosis and create the gametophyte generation. This, again, is a multicellular part. Now, this is what makes it unique, okay? Has this multicellular gametophyte generation. These gametophytes then are going to continue to do mitosis to create gametes. The gametes, guys, if you'll recall, are egg and sperm, each of which only have N chromosomes, okay? They then are going to go through the process of fertilization to create a new zygote and so on. And this is that life cycle of a plant. Now, guys, please be able to kind of mark up this cycle. All right. There's going to be times like in the lab as well as on exams, worksheets, things like that, that this is present and you're going to have to add the pieces into it. Okay. So making sure you understand the sporophyte is at the top, gametophyte is at the bottom, and what leads to what. Okay. So make sure that you review this. Now, this is a simplified version that I've put together just with the words. So it's more of like a flow chart. However, your textbook is going to have examples that are going to use more pictures. Okay, and that's what you're seeing here. So if you look, non-vascular plants, there's the sporophyte at the top and the gametophyte at the bottom. You'll notice, though, that that line is not right in the middle. Okay, the reason they do this is they're showing you that the sporophyte generation is smaller. It's not as present as the gametophyte generation. So when you are looking at a non-vascular plant, the plant part that you see is actually the gametophyte part. The sporophyte only comes out when it's ready to release spores. Okay, we then see the seedless vascular plants. There's a shift where we go down where the gametophyte is more reduced, it's smaller, and the part of the plant that you are seeing is going to be the sporophyte part. And then, of course, seed vascular plants are going to be also sporophytes being their dominant generation, whereas the gametophyte is the kind of smaller, reduced generation. So if we take a look, this is what you see too. If you notice that it's showing you how the sporophyte generation is getting bigger and the gametophyte generation is getting smaller in this picture. So you can see mosses, they are going to be where when you are seeing a moss, you are looking at the gametophyte generation. But if you're looking at ferns, gymnosperms like pine trees, or angiosperms like flowering plants or regular trees, those guys, you're seeing the sporophyte generation. Okay, now I know that this is different and kind of weird to think about, and there's all these new terms here, but please make sure that you pay attention to the terminology. So when we look at this, there is a progression from very simple plants to more complex plants here. Okay, just like we saw with animals where we went from simple animals like a sponge to very complex animals like us as humans. Plants have a similar kind of progression. Now, the 4 boxes that are in red are the ones we're going to focus in on. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the bryophytes. Bryophytes are going to be your mosses. Okay, we're then going to look at the ferns, which are your seedless plants. Okay, they're seedless, but they also have vascular tissue. And then we have the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. So in this part 1, we're going to focus on the mosses and the ferns. And then part 2, we're going to focus on the gymnosperms and angiosperms. Now, when you look at this cladogram and you look at how this progression takes place, one of the things that all of these have in common is they have to have a way to protect their embryo because they've moved on to land and they've got to protect it from drying out. So remember to go back and review those strategies that make land plants successful. Another thing that you end up seeing here is that this is when vascular tissue comes into play. So mosses don't have vascular tissue. That's why they grow right on the ground level. You don't see mosses being really tall. They're going to be right against the surface to where they can gain water very easily. Ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms can now grow up into the atmosphere. They can grow up against gravity because they have vascular tissue. Now, gymnosperms and angiosperms, they are going to be more advanced because they have the ability to create pollen grains and they can do a different kind of seed dispersal. All right, and this is going to be the more advanced part and why they can spread to lots and lots of different areas. All right, and so gymnosperms are going to have what we call naked seeds, whereas angiosperms have the covered seeds. And we'll talk, like I said, more about that in part 2. Angiosperms also have another big issue or big adaptation that helps them, and this is the development of a fruit and a flower. The fruit and the flower helps because it's going to help in pollination. Okay, pollination is moving the sperm to the egg. And this is going to help with fertilization, as well as the fruit being helpful in the dispersal of their seeds. Okay, and like I said, we'll go into more detail. So let's talk about our non-vascular plants first. These are known as the bryophytes. Examples here are hornworts, liverworts, and mosses. Now they are part of the phylum Bryophyta, okay? And again, one of the main examples that you're going to be looking at in the lab and that sort of thing are mosses. Their gameophyte generation is going to produce gametes. And it is going to be their dominant generation. So make sure that you recognize that because that's what makes this group unique, is the gameophyte generation is their dominant generation. The sporophyte generation does produce windblown spores. Okay, they make their spores that can be windblown to new areas, but that's going to be a very small part of their life cycle. Okay, and so remember, dominant generation here for this group is the gameophyte. All right, so this brings us to male versus female parts of a plant. Okay, now again, here's going to be some terms that are going to be very different than what you've heard before. So the male gamete here, the male sperm here, is flagellated, just like it is in animals, where it has a tail, so it must swim. It has to swim from the male part of the plant to the female part of the plant. So the male part of the plant is called the antheridia. Okay, so the antheridia is the male part of the plant, and it has to swim to the female part, which is called the archegonia. All right, so we're going from the antheridia to the archegonia. Now, this is dependent on water because how else can it swim? All right, and so this is again why it has to be close to the surface where water is going to be more present. And in order for this process to occur, fertilization to occur, it's dependent on water because it has to swim. The zygote, though, is protected, and it's protected inside of the female part of the plant, which is the archegonia. Okay, and so it's going to be protected from being dried out because of having that archegonia area. All right, so if you take a look here at the picture, you can see that the sperm is produced in the antherdial head. We then have the archegonia head is going to be where the egg needs to come in contact, okay, where they've got to come in contact with each other, all right? And so with that, in order for fertilization to occur, for them to merge together, water is going to have to be present. These are created from the sporangia, the spores, in order to then create the male and female parts, which are known as the gameophytes. Now, because we're looking at bryophytes and mosses don't have vascular tissue, they lack true roots, stems, and leaves. So they don't actually have roots, stems, and leaves. They do have these leaf-like bodies, and they are covered with a waxy cuticle, and this is to help, again, prevent water loss because they have moved on to land. But they're going to be very close to the surface. Gameophytes absorb nutrients and they're anchored by root-like structures. So they do have things that look like roots, but they are very primitive. They're not very well developed. Sporophyte generation is going to be the 2N generation. It is considered nutritionally dependent on the gameophyte. So again, this is why we say the gameophyte is more dominant because it could live independently. The sporophyte generation cannot. It has to be linked and connected to a gameophyte generation. Otherwise, it won't survive. All right, so it's dependent. It has to be linked and connected to a gameophyte generation. The sporophytes do produce windblown spores that disperse the species. And this is going to be how mosses spread around the area. So let's just take a little closer look. I know I have a small picture up here on this slide, but let's blow that picture up a little bit and look at it a little bit closer. So here is the moth's life cycle. So again, you'll notice this looks very similar to the one that I put together with just the words, okay? But they put some pictures with it. And so we have fertilization that takes place. Fertilization produces that new zygote. The zygote is 2 ends, so that light blue at the top is the diploid or sporophyte generation. This is going to go through mitosis, and it's going to create this kind of longer area that's on top of the gametophyte. So do you see the gametophyte is in green, and it has this structure that's kind of coming up out of it? That structure is the sporophyte. And inside that sporophyte, they are going to be producing spores. Okay, those spores then are going to get released. You can see them as the little red dots. Those red dots then are going to be able to be dispersed by the wind. When they land on the ground, they now are haploid in their generation. This is the gametophyte, and they start to grow. They grow through mitosis. And now they do have separate sexes. Some of them are male and some of them are considered female. They are then going to both be responsible for making their gametes, whether it's egg or sperm, releasing those into the environment with water needing to be present, because water is going to be how the sperm is going to swim towards the egg, and then fertilization can take place. And we see the cycle then continue. All right, and so this is showing you the life cycle of a moss. Now we're going to take a step up, and we're going to look at something that's a little more advanced. These are the vascular plants. Okay, the vascular plants do contain vascular tissue, which allows them to grow up higher against gravity. They don't have to rely on the surface of the ground. These are known as tracheophytes or tracheophytes. We do see that they are one of the most diverse and widely distributed plants. Their sporophyte generation does produce tissues of xylem and phloem. Xylem is the vascular tissue that carries the water and things up the plant. The phloem is going to carry the food that's created the leaves down to be stored and used by other parts of the plant. Okay, kind of like how arteries take blood away from our heart and veins bring it back. We have kind of the same thing here. So xylem is going to take fluids and substances up, and phloem are going to bring substances and other things back down, right, in their process. These guys also possess true roots, stems, and leaves. Okay, so they have those would be the organs of the plant. They actually have them, and they're well developed here. The sporophyte is also the dominant generation. It's the generation you see. So in the lab, when you take a look at ferns, these guys are going to be the ones that you are looking at. Okay, these are going to be the ones that you can see that is the sporophyte generation. These guys do produce spores, and they are what we call homosporous, meaning that they're the same. Homo means same. The gametophyte generation is avascular. It does not contain vascular tissue. So because of this, it's reduced and really small, okay, and it's going to rely on the sporophyte. Okay, so again, sporophyte generation is dominant. The gametophyte is small, and it's just going to be a small portion. These are grouped by if they produce spores. If they do spores, they're called seedless plants, or seeds if they do disperse their seeds through other species. Okay. Now, vascular seedless plants are the group we're going to focus in on here. They do produce spores used for dispersal of their species, and these are things like club moss, whisk ferns, horsetails, and then, of course, ferns. Okay, so that's the group we're going to be looking at and focusing in on here. So these guys are known as primitive vascular plants because they're more simple. Okay, they're more simple in structure. They're bigger than mosses, but they're not as large as, like, say, a pine tree or even like a bush or something like that. Okay, so the first one is Lycophyta. These are the club mosses. They do contain stem and small leaves that are going to be called microphyllus. Okay, micro just meaning small. They have these small leaf-like structures. Right, so that is one of the groups. And again, they're primitive. They've developed actually roots, stems, and leaves, but they're still very small. Okay, they're not very advanced. We also have the horsetails. The horsetails are part of the Tetraphyta. This group is going to thrive in marshes, okay? So areas where it's like real marshy and swampy. And they're known as jointed plants because they have these little joints that are present between sections of their taller stems. And you're going to get to take a look at these in the lab. The ferns are the biggest group we're going to be looking at, and they are the ones that are going to be a lot larger. They're a little bit more advanced vascular plants, but they are still considered seedless. So their gametophyte generation has been blown up here bigger so that you can take a look. They are still responsible for producing gametes. Gametes, remember, are your egg and your sperm, and you can see that here in the picture. Now, structures associated with this heart-shaped gametophyte generation, because if you'll notice, it looks kind of like a heart. We see that we have the antheridia. The antheridia is the male structure, and it's going to produce flagellated sperm. They're still producing sperm that's going to need to swim in this particular case. So water is still going to be very much important when we're talking about fertilization for ferns. The female structure that produces the egg or the ova is known as the archegonia. All right, so antheridia, archegonia. Now again, these are terms we saw back with the last group, but we're just reinforcing them. Fertilization is still water dependent. The male sperm must swim from the antheridia to the archegonia. So guys, if you'll notice, this is the second time we've talked about this, so it's very, very important. Okay. Now let's talk about the sporophyte generation, because this is the bigger generation of our ferns. So in this sporophyte generation, we do see that it produces wind-blown spores for the dispersal of their species. They're not actually making seeds here. This is why they're called seedless plants. Now, structures associated with the sporophyte generation in ferns are going to be things like fiddleheads. Fiddleheads are young, curled up fronds. Fronds are like the leaf-like structures that grow out of underground stems of the ferns. So the ferns, stems and roots are underground. The parts you're seeing are the leaves, and they're known as the fronds. Now the ones that are coming out and they're kind of curled and they're going to uncurl are called the fiddleheads. A frond refers to the leaf that contains many little leaflets of the fern. So on these fronds, there are going to be sac-like structures where meiosis is occurring, and they're creating these spores. These spores are going to be produced on the underside of those little leaves on those fronds. Now, a collective group of sporangia, okay, sporangia are the ones making the spores. A group of them is called sori. Okay, and so we can look at that, and when we see that that's the plural form, a singular one would be a sorus. Okay, and so we have a couple of different pictures for you to take a look at. You can see the spores are in this like kind of orangey color on the colored picture. Okay, they're found on the underside of the leaves of the fern. So let's take a closer look where we put the two generations together in the fern life cycle. So if we take a look here at the fern life cycle, we do see that you have the diploid generation and you have the haploid generation. So the diploid generation, after fertilization, there is the zygote. The zygote undergoes mitosis. It then grows into the plant that we see as the fern, okay, the sporophyte. These structures are then responsible for creating the actual spores, and they do this in the structure called the sori or the sporangia. They're those orange-like areas, and it kind of looks like little grains of sand or pollen is kind of what it looks like, but they are spores. Those spores get released, and when they get released, they are going to then disperse the species, growing into that little heart-shaped gametophyte that we saw in the picture. This gametophyte is going to produce egg and sperm, relying again on water because the sperm is flagellated to go find the egg so that fertilization can occur and we start the process back over. Okay, and so that's what we're looking at for the fern life cycle. So a quick little note here, gameophyte generation is nutritionally dependent to the sporophyte generation when we're talking about ferns. Because remember, the sporophyte is the dominant generation. And what's the economic importance a lot of times for this particular group? Well, we use them a lot for decorative greenery. We put them in floral arrangements. We also use them a lot as houseplants. They're very decorative. They're a lot of times easy to keep alive inside the house. And they also do help clean our air. They are filter. They filter specifically out carbon dioxide and they put more oxygen into the air. We do see that Native Americans have also used these types of plants for medicinal purposes. Okay, so they do have some economic importance. All right, so this finishes up our intro where we went over some terminology and we talked about the more primitive plants. In part 2, we're going to get into the vascular seed plants. These are going to be the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. But if you have any questions, please let me know.